4:17 p.m., the spillway gate finally moved, and the first sheet of water slid into the dry channel like a quiet verdict. Beyond the cattails, a brand new subdivision shimmered in the late light, cul-de-sacs arcing across ground my grandfather deeded and survey pins still marked. For months I sent maps, easements, hydrology notes, every warning ignored while fines stacked and the HOA doubled down. Sirens never came, only the steady rise of lawful water reclaiming its path, inch by inch across sod and fresh driveways. This was not a tantrum. It was a boundary remembering itself. When an HOA builds 135 homes on your land, what line would you defend? I bought the house for the quiet more than the square footage. It sat at the end of a cul-de-sac where bikes drew chalk circles that lasted through a summer storm, and the postman knew the dog's name. On cool evenings, I'd trim the roses along the side yard, measure the fence panels I planned to replace, and wave to the same 3 neighbors who always walked just before sunset. It was the kind of place where people borrowed ladders and returned them cleaner than they found them, where the lake at the far end of the greenbelt looked silver in the early morning, and the only traffic was school runs and grocery drops. The HOA existed mostly in emails, monthly reminders about dues, notes on holiday lights, a spring picnic that promised a bouncy castle, and always delivered a folding table with supermarket cupcakes. I read the rules when I moved in like most people do. Fences in good repair, lawns tidy, paint from the approved palette. Nothing unusual. I budgeted for dues and set a reminder, then got on with life. Work happened at the kitchen table. I'm a planner by nature, and if I'm honest, I enjoy a neat line and a clear margin. The fence posts were on my list because I like projects that finish with a tape measure clicking shut. I kept the garden simple, roses on the south side where the sun hits hard. Low shrubs out front so the house looks open and friendly. The only thing that felt truly old was a short run of stones tucked into the grass by the side gate, a line that looked like nothing if you were not looking for it. The previous owner told me it marked the original boundary from when the lots were carved up, long before the subdivision had a logo and rules. The board changed after the last election. Nothing dramatic at first. A new newsletter banner, fresh talk about standards, a WhatsApp group where the same 5 names posted photos of wheelie bins left out and cars parked the wrong way. The tone crept from helpful to watchful. A neighbor who used to wave started filming landscaping crews from her porch. People noticed and pretended not to. In early spring, the HOA sent a survey crew to update common area records. They painted new witness marks near the greenbelt and left tiny flags so bright they made the grass look artificial. A week later, copies of the updated plat appeared on the portal with a note that it clarified several side yard offsets. I clicked out of habit and scanned my block. My lot line looked tighter than before, like someone had shaved a sliver from the side yard and pushed it into the shared strip that runs toward the lake's drainage channel. It was only a foot, maybe less, but it nudged the roses and the fence posts from tidy to technical. I told myself it was a drawing quirk and closed the tab. The next weeks were normal on the surface. Morning coffee, school buses, dinners that smelled of garlic and butter, but the group chat buzzed. New reminders, fresh photos, a post from a board member about bringing all fences up to code height and placement by summer. I measured mine like I measure everything. Plumb, setback. Nothing wild. I set a calendar slot to pick up the replacement panels and moved on. That small stone line kept catching my eye. It was nothing more than 3 weathered chunks, rounded by a mower in time. Still, it lined up perfectly with the old iron pin by the corner. I looked at the new plat again, then dug out my title file. I had skimmed it when I bought the house. Now I read it properly. The legal description was the old kind, the meets and bounds paragraphs that walk you around a property using distances and landmarks, calling out bearings and markers. It referenced the iron pin at the back, then ran east to an established stone line. The language was dry, but the meaning was simple. The side boundary in my deed had not moved in decades. I photocopied the page and put it back. There is a difference between being certain and being ready to argue. I wanted to be both. I checked old aerials online and saw the same faint line in photos from years ago. I checked the county site and matched the coordinates. Nothing about it felt like a fight until the orange notice showed up. The notice said my fence was out of compliance by a specific number of inches and that ornamental plants could not encroach into the common strip. It gave me 10 days to remove and repaint, or fines would start daily. The phrasing was firm with a warning that further violations might lead to a hearing. It arrived on a Tuesday before bin day. The kind of detail you remember because you were already thinking about small chores, and then a larger one arrived on your door. I walked the line again in the evening light and felt that inch like a weight. The roses were not wild. The fence was not crooked. What changed was a drawing on a portal, and the confidence of people who believed a new PDF could overrule an old line set in the ground. The neighbors who used to wave kept their eyes on their phones. That was when I began to keep notes, dates, names, screenshots. Not because I wanted a fight, but because I understood the shape of one when I saw it forming. The lake and its drainage channel run behind the greenbelt. In the wet season, the channel fills, then settles to a trickle. There is an easement recorded against the lots that touch the strip, a right of access to maintain the drain if it ever clogs. I knew this because my title packet came with the easement page marked. It seemed like a sensible thing no one would ever need, a line about water doing what water does. It sat in the file like a spare key. The board scheduled a courtesy inspection walk for our side of the street. The email was warm on the surface and cold underneath, the way frost looks pretty until you slip on it. I set out my documents and took a final quiet evening in the garden, the kind where you listen to sprinklers ticking and think about nothing. I wanted to fix fence panels and prune roses, not measure encroachments and print statutes. But the story was shifting, and you could feel it in the way the street talked about rules more than neighbors. None of this was about paint or petals. It was about ownership and lines and the difference between a rule book and a deed. I was still the same person who waved from the side yard. The board, though, had become something else, and the moment they stepped onto the grass with clipboards and a camera, the dispute that had been humming quietly in the background finally found its volume. The inspection walk began with clipboards and smiles that didn't reach the eyes. 2 board members and the property manager moved in a straight line down the street, pausing at each house to take photos of soffits, gutters, and mailboxes as if they were cataloging specimens. The new newsletter had promised a friendly checkup. What arrived at my gate felt like an audit. They stood on the grass with a measuring wheel and a laser tape, pointed at my fence posts, then at the roses, then at the old iron pin in the back corner as if it were a stray object to be removed. The property manager read from a template: setbacks, encroachment, corrective action. A fluorescent tag appeared on my latch, bright as a warning flare. The walk moved on, but the tag stayed, and I watched neighbors lean into their blinds the way people watch weather, waiting to see if a storm will break their way. The first fine landed the next morning. A line item in the portal: fence non-compliance, $50 day until corrected. It ticked like a metronome, one charge added at midnight, precise as a clock and just as indifferent. I replied with a page from my deed that called out the stone line and the pin. I attached screenshots of the old aerials. I asked for the surveyor's field notes that supported the update to the plat. The response was a form letter with a new attachment: Architectural Standards Addendum V2, approved 2 days earlier, requiring board pre-approval for any fence repair or replacement, and limiting material choices to a vendor list that happened to feature one contractor at triple the normal price. The addendum also forbade ornamental plantings that touch shared boundaries. The roses had become a policy violation by proximity. The group chat lit up with photos of problem areas. My yard appeared, cropped and circled. The curves of my shrubs were labeled overgrowth, in red text that looked like it belonged on a crime scene photo. A neighbor I barely knew posted that rules existed for a reason, and that people who bought into communities agreed to follow them. The same names cheered. The fence contractor from the new vendor list posted an introductory note and a link to a calendar for compliance consultations. The timing was not subtle. I hired my own surveyor. The appointment took 15 minutes at the corner pin and 30 in the side yard, where he measured the run by the stones twice. He pointed at the bearing in my legal description, the one that matched the old meets and bounds directions, rather than the new overlay. He wrote a short letter on letterhead that stated the obvious. The deed line and the updated plat did not match, and without field notes or a recorded boundary adjustment, the deed line controlled. He stamped it and shook his head like a man who sees the same problem weekly, and knows how it ends when people pretend paper outruns ground. I sent the letter by certified mail and email. The board acknowledged receipt and scheduled a hearing. Before the date arrived, 2 more fines posted. Yard debris visible, for a bundle of replacement fence slats leaned in my side yard, and trash receptacle in view, because my bin sat at the edge of my driveway the evening before pickup. The tone had shifted from tidy rules to targeted enforcement. The property manager began to park at the end of the cul-de-sac at odd hours. I watched him photograph my gate at 9:12 p.m. and my porch at 6:08 a.m. and wondered when. Compliance had become surveillance. The hearing felt like a play where the ending was decided before the curtain rose. The board sat in a row behind a folding table, a row of bottled waters aligned like props. A red binder with my name on the spine sat in front of the president. The property manager read the alleged violations into the record. My packet of evidence, deed page, survey letter, aerials, dates, waited in a neat stack. I spoke in calm sentences and offered copies. The president smiled without moving her eyes and asked whether I had considered moving the fence inward to avoid the appearance of encroachment. When I asked for the survey field notes that supported the updated plat, the answer was that the contractor's materials were proprietary. When I read the paragraph from the covenants that required documented basis for enforcement, the treasurer flipped to a new page and asked if I had reapplied for architectural approval, using the updated forms. The vote took 10 seconds and returned 3 words. Violations upheld. Fines continue. The lien letter arrived 2 weeks later. A terse notice that unpaid assessments and fines could be converted into a lien against the property, with collection costs and attorney fees added. The amount looked small on its own and large in its trajectory, a number engineered to sting without inspiring immediate counsel. I called a local attorney anyway. He had a drawer full of HOA stories and a schedule full of people who learned too late that quiet does not equal peace. He advised the paper trail, the certified letters, the escrow notice to my mortgage servicer, and a calm insistence on the recorded deed as the controlling instrument. He asked a question I hadn't considered. Had the association recently beautified the green belt by the drainage channel? Cosmetic work sometimes clogged what engineers meant to stay clear. I walked the green belt with new eyes. Fresh river stones lined the channel like a magazine spread. New shrubs sat where grasses used to shed debris into the flow. The spillway gate near the lake looked polished. Someone had painted the small metal sign that described the maintenance easement, the first clear coat of attention it had seen in years. The channel was pretty and wrong. Where the water should have moved cleanly under the grates, fabric had been pinned to hold stones in place, the kind that shifts in the first heavy rain and creates a dam for leaves. A neat concept assembled by people who like tidy lines more than working water. The spring storms arrived on schedule. The first brought a hard hour of rain that turned the road into a mirror and washed pollen stripes into the gutters. The channel filled and bled off slowly. I photographed the backing debris against the fabric at the grates and sent the pictures to the board, with a note quoting the easement language from my title. Right of access to maintain drainage. The reply thanked me for my concern and reminded me that landscape modifications in common areas required board approval. 2 days later, the property manager placed a new tag on my gate. Unapproved access to common area. $100 the harassment shifted to small intrusions. A landscaper hired by the association stepped onto my side yard and clipped the ends of the roses that leaned past the invisible new line. He left petals scattered like confetti, and a note reminding me of plant placement rules. A board member posted a photo of my porch rug and asked whether it met the neutral tones guideline. Contractor appeared at midday and measured the fence without announcing himself. When I stepped into the yard, he lifted his hands, said he was just pre-quoting for the board, and left a glossy brochure for a full replacement package that would remove the panels flush inside the invented boundary, at a price that could pay a semester of school. I sent a cease and desist for trespass and demanded all future contact be in writing. The attorney added his letterhead to mine and copied the county's code enforcement office on the drainage concern. The board responded by scheduling a common area enhancement day and inviting volunteers to help place additional stone along the channel. The photo on the flyer showed an arrangement that would have been perfect in a courtyard. In a live drainage system, it was a choke point disguised as a centerpiece. The second storm lasted longer. The channel backed up before the rain line reached its peak, and water eased over the grass into yards that had never felt it. Neighbors who never attended meetings knocked on doors and pointed at the rising line with the urgency of people who recognize a thing that does not care about rules. The property manager sent a message reminding residents to avoid the greenbelt due to slippery conditions. The board posted a note about temporary pooling and advised patience. By late afternoon, 2 yards on the other side of the channel had standing water against their foundations. I took photos of the debris mat at the spillway and noted the way the water tried to find the old low point, where if the stones weren't there, it would have run clean to the lake. I called the county. The engineer on duty asked for location and photos. He sounded tired and competent, the way people do when they serve a jurisdiction that constantly replaces function with ornament. He confirmed the easement covered maintenance for exactly this situation. He advised keeping documentation, and if the board refused access, logging the refusal. He offered to send a letter reminding the association of its responsibility. The letter arrived 2 days later and joined the stack on the board's table like every other piece of paper that said, "Do the sensible." thing, the fines kept ticking daily. Then, added fees for administrative processing. The portal's tone shifted from formality to condescension, with boilerplate about community standards and respect. The lean threat hardened into a timeline. The property manager began to call from a blocked number and leave voicemails describing additional inspections and possible tow actions for non-compliant parking if my contractor's truck returned. Sleep thinned to a shallow layer. I set my phone to vibrate and arranged documents in a binder by tab, as if order could absorb aggression. The stone line in the grass waited as steady as always, a physical fact surrounded by paperwork that pretended it wasn't. Then came the morning that changed everything. A neighbor from 2 streets over posted a photo of water entering his crawlspace. He was not part of the usual chorus. He didn't care about my fence or my roses. He cared that the channel meant to carry rain was now a decorative feature that trapped it. The comment thread turned from rules to consequences. A board member replied that unusual precipitation events were beyond the scope of the covenants. The county engineer replied to the thread with a link to the recorded easement and a plain sentence. Maintenance is not optional. I stood at the spillway that evening with the easement page in my pocket and the storm radar on my phone pulsing green and yellow. The fabric pinned under the stones looked like a sick bandage. The gate mechanism, simple, old, designed to be cranked open when debris threatened flow, wore a cable lock that had not been there last season. The association had secured a public safety valve to protect a landscaping choice. Water pushed against the grate with a low, steady sound, like breathing through a blocked nose. The forecast promised 6 more hours of rain. I sent one more email with photos and a short, direct sentence. The gate needs to open now. The reply came from the property manager with a line that read like a dare. Residents are prohibited from manipulating common infrastructure. The county engineer's second letter arrived in my inbox minutes later, addressed to the board and copied to me, citing the statute that allowed any party to an easement to perform necessary maintenance when the responsible party failed to act. It was the sentence I had been waiting for, and the permission the board had been hoping I didn't understand. The rain strengthened. The channel overtopped the decorative edge and ran into the grass in a thin sheet that widened by the minute. Lights came on in back windows. A siren wailed somewhere far enough away to be useless. The cable lock on the gate glinted in my flashlight beam. I thought about the liens and the fines, the photos and the tags, the stone set by someone who wanted pretty more than safe. I thought about the old legal description that walked me along the ground like a measured prayer. The water rose another inch. The decision stopped being a question and became a time. The wrench fit the bolt on the lock bracket the way old tools feel designed for the job they find. The first turn was stiff. The second was easier. I felt the mechanism give in a way that had nothing to do with rules and everything to do with physics. The gate groaned under pressure, then shifted. The jam of leaves and fabric shuddered. A crack opened in the mat like a mouth finding air. The channel pulled in water like a lung, fast and hungry. The sheet on the grass thinned and edged backward. A light turned on at the clubhouse. A phone rang inside a house whose occupant had never waved. By the time the storm settled to a hard drizzle, the channel ran clear, and the lake took the excess the way it was designed to. The roses glittered under porch light as if nothing had happened. The fluorescent tag on my gate fluttered against the latch in the wet breeze. My phone buzzed with a new message from the board. An emergency meeting would be held at 9 a.m. to address unauthorized actions by a resident. The county engineer sent a second message that used the words averted damage and documented adverse modifications. I closed the gate and watched water do what it always does when people stop trying to make it behave like decor. The next day would not be about fences or shrubs. It would be about the moment a committee chose aesthetics over function, and then insisted on obedience, while the ground rejected their plan. The board would line up behind their table and call it vandalism. The county would call it maintenance. Neighbors who had never cared about my side yard would fill seats because their carpets had been wet. And somewhere under the grass the old stone line would wait, patient as geology, for people to remember what holds. The emergency meeting filled before the doors opened. Folding chairs scraped tile, neighbors stood along the back wall, and phones hovered at chest height already recording. The board sat in a line behind a long table, bottled water aligned like a second gavel. The property manager occupied the end with a laptop and a stack of violation packets bound in red. The agenda on the projector led with a single item: unauthorized resident action affecting common infrastructure. The room carried that thin strain of anger and embarrassment people feel when something nearly goes wrong and someone else fixes it first. I arrived with a binder and a small cardboard box. The binder held what the board ignored. The box held what the channel kept trying to return. The county engineer stood by the back wall with a clipboard and a rolled map under his arm. Not introduced, not hidden, just present. Two neighbors from the far side, the ones whose carpets had been wet, sat in the front row, knees forward, faces set. The contractor from the preferred vendor list hovered near the side door, close enough to hear, far enough to claim he had only stopped by. The president read a statement about safety, rules, and respect. Her voice was steady, trained by repetition, built to carry over hum. She called the opening of the Spillway gate vandalism, framed it as reckless, and promised consequences. The property manager slid a photo onto the screen, a grainy still of the gate with its cable lock hanging loose. He narrated fines, penalties, and the process to impose a lien and seek injunctions. The problem with this performance was the watermark on the carpet in the front row, and the rolled letter in the county engineer's hand. I opened the binder to the first tab labeled Timeline. Dates and images lined up in a single column from the day the updated plat appeared to the night the channel ran clear. The photos did not need captions. Bright flags and new grass, decorative stone pinned with fabric at the grate, debris stacked like a mat against a choke point, rising water line against a foundation. The gate with a lock that no one could point to in any maintenance record. The final photo showed the water pulling through once the lock had been removed, and the gate had moved as designed. The room adjusted its weight from one foot to the other. The board tried to pivot to fences. The projector answered with the second tab, Deed. The meets and bounds paragraph from my title sat beside the surveyor's letter, stamped and signed, calling out the iron pin at the rear and the established stone line along the side. On the next slide, the county parcel overlay showed the updated plat pressed over the old grid, like a tracing that missed its mark. The line drifted into my yard on paper and stopped at a stone in the grass in reality. The line everyone could see from their chairs didn't care about an addendum approved in a private email chain. I placed the cardboard box on the table and opened it. Inside sat a scoop of silt, leaves, and pieces of the same fabric pinned under the stones at the spillway grate. I had collected it at dawn where the channel had tried to breathe. No theatrics, no speech. A small, damp summary. The property manager's eyes locked on it, as if the mess might climb out and smear his minutes. The contractor shifted at the door. The county engineer unfolded his rolled letter. The turning point did not arrive as outrage. It arrived as process. The engineer introduced a notice of violation issued under the drainage code and the recorded easement that bound the association to maintain flow. The notice cataloged the modifications: fabric and decorative stone that reduced capacity, a cable lock that prevented emergency operation, and unauthorized landscaping in a live drainage system. It attached the photos the board had already seen and added dates. It required immediate removal of the obstructions, restoration of the channel to functional condition, and written confirmation of compliance within 10 days. It stated that failure would trigger county fines per day, assessed to the association, not to any resident. Phones lifted higher in the back row. No one clapped. Relief can be quiet. The property manager tried to return to the subject of unauthorized action. The county letter answered it without drama. The maintenance easement allowed any party to perform necessary work when the responsible party failed to act, and flooding was imminent. The gate had been opened to prevent damage. The notice used the words lawful and necessary. In a single page, the fines ticking against my portal lost their footing. The numbers still sat there, but their center had shifted. The board's story, that rule-breaking was the problem and the board was the solution, cracked at the line where water met carpet. The contractor drifted closer to the table, as if distance could turn into exit. The next tab in my binder carried a title in plain type: Procurement. Screenshots of the preferred vendor list sat beside a state business registry entry that linked the contractor to an LLC that shared a postal box with the property manager's firm. Meeting minutes from the review committee that approved the list were stamped as received 3 days after the addendum appeared on the portal. No bids, no conflict disclosures, no public vote. A neat circle drawn around a stream of work. The room did not groan. It simply went still. The board president adjusted her papers. The treasurer looked at the boxes of bottled water, as if choosing a label might buy time. The property manager pulled at his collar. People who had spent months arguing about bin placement and approved paint hues now watched a different kind of rule come into view. This one had numbers attached that pointed back at the table. The fines they used as a lever could be matched by penalties flowing the other way. The board called a closed session. The county engineer declined. Open meeting rules applied to matters of potential board action involving the community. The contractor slipped out the side door. When the board returned, they tried to split the page. They proposed to waive some of my fines if I filed new applications using the updated forms, and agreed to move my fence inside the line on the overlay. They offered to review the roses if I replaced them with an approved shrub from a pallet. They called it a compromise. The projector answered with the third tab, recording. There had been no recorded boundary adjustment at the county. There had been an email, a PDF, and a belief that a graphic could replace a deed. The surveyor's affidavit repeated the sentence the board kept dodging. The recorded legal description controls. The climax did not rely on volume. It relied on sequence. Deed, easement, evidence, notice. Each piece had a date, a signature, and a photograph. The board's leverage, shame, small fines, social pressure, faded in a room where neighbors had watched water test the work the board had installed. The box of silt on the table made a better exhibit than any speech. The phones carried it to the street. The mortgage servicer's letter slid across next, confirmed receipt of an escrow hold pending resolution of a disputed lien. It notified the association that improper liens against the property would be contested, and that payments to the association would be held aside during dispute. The board's threat to convert fines into a lien no longer sounded like a ticking clock. It sounded like a wrong turn into a wall. A recall petition appeared in the hands of a neighbor I had never met. A person without any interest in roses or fences who now cared about drains and integrity. Signatures already lined one page. The petition did not ask for heads. It asked for transparency, recorded votes, third-party bids, and a return to the basic point of an association, to maintain what works and leave what isn't broken alone. The paper moved down the aisle. Faces that had looked away from me for months now looked at the board. Embarrassment can be a quiet teacher, and the room had just sat through class. The property manager announced a violation of decorum. The county engineer lifted the notice again, the one with the words "immediate abatement," and asked for a start date. No voices needed to rise. The board had a choice between paying per day for a mistake or rolling up sleeves and removing harmless-looking stone that nearly turned a greenbelt into a shallow lake. The president's hand hovered over the gavel and then dropped. A vote happened in the open. It carried. The lock would be removed permanently. The fabric would be pulled. The channel would be restored under county supervision within the week. The addendum that invented proximity violations for plants and routed fence work to a single vendor would be suspended pending review. Vindication rarely feels like triumph. It feels like gravity returning after a long float through a room where nothing touches ground. Relief arrived as a breath I did not know I had been holding since the first fluorescent tag appeared on my gate. Anger did not vanish. It settled into the corners like dust that the next rain would carry away, if the path stayed clear. I closed the binder and picked up the box. The board turned to the last page of the county notice, the one that listed penalties for failing to comply, and the requirement to notify insurers of the near miss. People rose from chairs, slower than they had sat, as if not wanting to break the spell of a room briefly aligned with sense. The carpet line in the front row would lighten over time. The old iron pin in the back corner of my garden would continue to wait, unbothered by paper. The roses would bloom or not based on weather and care, not on a pallet. On the way out, the county engineer taped a copy of the red notice to the clubhouse door. The same tape that held tags to my latch now held a rule to theirs. Neighbors stopped to photograph it. The image would be in dozens of feeds before lunch. The property manager stared at the ground he had tried to manage into submission, and seemed to recognize, at last, that water does not bargain. The meeting ended, but the story did not. The fines had lost their footing, the lock had lost its authority, and the board had lost the room. What remained was the reckoning that follows a near disaster, restoration, restitution, and a decision about who should be in charge of either. The gavel fell one last time for adjournment, and the echo carried into the hall. What comes next is not a victory lap. It is the bill, the repairs, the votes, and the quiet work of putting boundaries back where they belong. And when the first stones came out of the channel under the same sky that had watched everything, the question changed from whether they would make it right to whether they would be allowed to stay and do it. The repairs began before most of the street had boiled a kettle. County trucks eased onto the greenbelt, hazard lights pulsing against wet grass, and a small crew set out tools that looked ordinary until you saw what they were removing. The decorative stone went first, lifted away in neat buckets that left the channel raw and honest again. The geotextile fabric that had been pinned under the rocks came up like a bad peel, black with silt and leaf mulch, the exact material a drainage engineer calls trouble. The cable lock on the spillway gate, the one that had turned a safety valve into a showpiece, clattered into a plastic crate with a sound that felt like breath returning to a room. A high-vis inspector cycled the gate through its full travel, wrote the date on a metal tag, and fixed it to the frame with rivets that would outlast anyone's term on a committee. Their compliance plan appeared on the portal with none of the old gloss. No clip art, no syrup about community spirit. Just a numbered list, time-stamped and co-signed by the county. Remove non-functional landscaping from the flow path. Restore the original capacity in line with recorded plans. Implement a quarterly inspection schedule. Publish inspection logs to residents. Keep the spillway accessible and unlocked except during maintenance. Train volunteers to spot blockages and call them in before water makes its own decision. It read like a translation out of politics and into physics. Money followed swiftly. County fines were immediate and itemized. Insurance sent a polite but pointed query about non-compliant modifications and risk management. The association solicitor recommended new procurement rules before renewal, and for once, "We'll look into it," did not hold. A recall petition has a way of turning vagueness into a countdown. The property manager's firm faced its own weather. Emails from residents asking about shared post boxes and preferred vendor lists, and a quiet call from a state office that monitors conflicts of interest. No one needed a scandal. Everyone needed a record that would stand in the daylight. The lien threat against my home dissolved with 3 unemotional lines. Assessment balance amended to 0. Enforcement suspended. Violations reversed. The fines disappeared from the portal without the theater that had brought them there. A second notice replaced the first, acknowledging the recorded deed line, accepting the surveyor's letter, and committing to update the association's internal overlays to match the county's records. It arrived with less ceremony than a bin day reminder, and carried more weight than a season of newsletters. Repair spread beyond the channel. A real drainage firm walked the entire strip with clipboards and dye, mapping how water wants to move when the sky means business. They flagged low spots, roots that would lift grates in a year, gravel that had migrated where it shouldn't, and shrubs that looked lovely in estate brochures and behaved badly near an inlet. They wrote a simple plan any volunteer could understand. Native grasses on the margins, nothing with heavy leaf drop near the run, compact gravel that won't travel, and clear sight lines to the spillway so you can tell at a glance whether it can breathe. They added a sign in plain language that said what the channel is for, and why it sometimes looks bare. Beauty, they explained without fuss, is a path that stays open when it must. Consequences landed with a steady beat. 2 households whose carpets had taken water received checks that covered drying, skirting boards, and paint. Insurance paid. The apology letter that came with them used complete sentences and the right subject. Not mistakes were made, we did this. We will not do it again. The county closed its notice only after a re-inspection in a proper rain, and a set of photos that showed the grate clear and the spillway unlocked. The inspector added the green belt to a periodic list. This was not punishment. It was memory turned into a schedule. Politics reset in a school cafeteria that smelled faintly of disinfectant and old glue. People who had never bothered with HOA ballots queued with coffee and folded papers. The president kept her seat by 2 votes, then resigned to spend more time with family. A week later, when the procurement file went public, the treasurer did not stand again. 2 new faces joined the table, the kind of people who bring clipboards and questions rather than slogans. The management contract went out to bid with an actual brief and a deadline visible to all. 3 firms presented in an open session. The one whose postal box matched the contractor's did not appear. A new company took over with less chat and more calendars. The first policy they passed should never have needed a vote. 3 competitive bids for any contract over a sensible threshold. Conflicts of interest disclosed on paper and read aloud before votes. Agendas posted 72 hours in advance. Minutes published promptly with recorded votes by name. Architectural standards reviewed in public with an appeal path that doesn't feel like theater. A complaint log anyone can read, so rules can't be used as a private cudgel. A deferred maintenance list for drains, pavements, lights, and roofs. The unglamorous things that quietly keep a place civilized. It was boring in the best way. You could feel tension bleed out of the chat because the work had somewhere to live besides rumor. On my side of the fence, the fixes were physical and small and precisely right. A new iron pin, stamped and set deep at the rear corner where the old one leaned, tied the legal description back to metal and soil. The surveyor filed the mark at the county. The association updated its overlay to match. 2 neighbors who had been nudged by the same bad drawing received written reversals. One had already moved his fence inward under pressure. The association paid to put it back and replaced his tired panels while they were at it. He watched the crew work with the wary look of someone who has learned not to expect care. By the end of the afternoon, the latch clicked shut with that snug, grateful note wood makes when it belongs where it is. The street changed by degrees you could only see in the round. The WhatsApp channel still pinged, but the tone shifted from capture to maintenance. Instead of red circles around shrubs, people posted potholes, loose curbstones, a flickering lamp, a cracked cover at a drain inlet. The new board kept a live tracker where anyone could see what had been logged, who was on it, and when it would be done. Progress bars replaced pylons. The neighbor who used to film crews signed up for the volunteer inspection day and brought biscuits for the team. You could call that hypocrisy. It felt more like conversion at the slow speed of ordinary time. The next proper storm arrived, curled in from the west, a long band of gray stitched with yellow on the radar. The first hard hour sent rain racing along the curbs. The channel took it, steady and cool. The grate breathed in and out, a soft gurgle and a low rush, the sound of a system doing its job. In places where fabric had once pinched the run, the water spun in brief eddies and then moved on, like a shoulder rolling out a knot. The lake accepted the overflow without fuss. The spillway sat at the right notch, neither starved nor choking. From my back step, the noise was not dramatic. It was confident. Function is a kind of peace you only notice after it has been missing. Not everything wrapped in a bow. A state office asked the management company to produce emails and invoices related to the vendor list. A polite inquiry turned into compliance training, and a fine that fit into a budget, and a lesson that fit into pride. The company issued a statement about updated ethics procedures that read like someone had pressed a solicitor's template into service. No one marched. Everyone kept the receipt. Memory again, shaped into policy. The personal aftermath landed in quieter rooms. I shifted the binder of evidence from the kitchen table to a shelf, and tried not to reach for it every time an email pinged. I replanted along the side bed and trained the roses to a line that felt deliberate, rather than defensive. I ordered timber for the fence panels from my own contractor, and got a stamped approval without being treated like a suspect. I still walk the stone line in the grass sometimes and touch the new iron pin with my foot, to remind myself that recorded ground and quiet work beat volume and performance. That habit may stay for good. It costs nothing and returns calm. The wider lessons emerged in useful sentences. A deed is not a brochure. A PDF cannot move a boundary that sits in the soil and law. A maintenance easement is not decoration. It is the permission structure for common sense. If your rules cannot live in daylight, they should not live at all. If your contractor cannot win in an open room, they should not be in your drains. None of these thoughts look heroic on a thumbnail. All of them are the difference between a quiet street and a mess that arrives just after midnight. For anyone watching from a street like ours, because there are many, the pattern that worked was repeatable. Read your legal description slowly, not like you're skimming a manual, but like you're tracing a map with a finger. Walk your lines. Learn the old pins and the markers that mattered before a logo. Keep dates and photos as if you'll need them when you least want to. Use the county for the jobs only the county can do. Drainage, easements, safety systems. When you're told no, ask for the statute in the field notes. If a meeting hole is where actions go to vanish, put a notice on the door. If fines become a pressure tactic, put them under lights where they either justify themselves or evaporate. None of it requires rage. All of it requires staying in the room when the other side hopes you'll leave. The biggest change was not the free-moving gate or the new policy page. It was the tilt of the street toward function over performance. People remembered the near miss more clearly than months of small theater. They remembered the brown line at a skirting board, and the sound a channel makes when it clears. The day a damp box of silt sat on a folding table and said more than paragraphs became a story that parents told at the bus stop without needing names. That's how norms shift. Not with epics, but with a steady choice for the plain thing that works. In time, our association will forget this board's names. It will still have the sign that explains why the channel isn't a water feature, and the calendar reminder that nudges someone to check the gate before storm season. It will still have a procurement rule that prevents cozy loops. It will still have an appeal path that fits on a page. It will still have a green belt that looks a little less manicured than a brochure, and a lot more like a promise kept. Those are the kinds of outcomes that matter because they stop being outcomes and become simply the way things are. On ordinary evenings, the place looks like it did before any of this. Kids chalk circles that survive a light shower. The postie still knows the dog's name. The roses do what roses do, blazing and then dropping. A small ceremony of renewal that doesn't ask permission. And when clouds build and the air changes, the street doesn't hold its breath. It listens for the channel. If you've lived through the other way, you can hear the difference. A soft, assured rush that says somebody kept their promise. Here is the takeaway I would leave with anyone who lives where committees write letters and neighbors hold cameras. The ground under your feet has a memory. So does water. They do not argue, they wait. Learn to read them. Put your rules on top of those facts and not the other way around. Replace secrecy with process, performance with service, power with care. Proof beats volume, patience beats bluster. And when something finally has to move, let it be the gate, not the line that holds you all together. In the end, the satisfying part was not winning an argument. It was watching a system remember what it is for. It was hearing in a clean rush past a cleared grate the sound of a community telling the truth. And if you ever wonder whether yours is getting it right, you don't need a meeting to find out. Wait for the rain, stand by the channel and listen.